Hello there and welcome to this German GCSE and iGCSE video tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to look at separable and inseparable prefix verbs. So another part of German GCSE and iGCSE grammar, another thing that students potentially find quite tricky, and another key difference between German and English. Okay, just to introduce myself, firstly, I'm Dhananjay Talwar. I studied French and Italian for my MA degree at the University of Cambridge, graduating in 2015. I've been in the field of education since that time, spending most of that time as a tutor, and I've been a full-time tutor for over 6 years now. I'm really passionate about languages and language learning in general. I've learned more than 20 of them to different levels, at least 9 of those to fluency, of which German is, of course, one. It's one that I did for GCSE actually at school before practicing quite a bit elsewhere. Yeah, and one that I've taught to many students at GCSE and iGCSE level too. Along with learning languages, I really enjoy teaching them and helping students, motivating them, making sure they know the benefits of learning languages and methods to get them efficiently to their target grade in exams like GCSEs or iGCSEs. And up till now, I've helped more than 500 different students to achieve or even surpass their target grade for GCSE or iGCSE language exams. I've taught 8 languages to GCSE level so far, and some at high levels as well. Okay, now moving on to the German GCSE and iGCSE exam boards. These exam boards are very relevant for the final exams. Make sure you're clear on the differences between the exam boards, or more specifically, what the exam and each of the papers will look like and consist of for you, because they do change a bit from one exam board to the next. But this video is about German grammar, specifically separable and inseparable prefix verbs. So that means that it will be relevant for all students, whether you're studying AQA, Pearson, Edexcel, Educas, or Cambridge iGCSE, or a different exam board. Everybody needs to know this part of German grammar as well as possible for GCSE and iGCSE. So carry on watching, but do note down what exam board you're studying as well. Okay, so moving on then to separable and inseparable prefix verbs. This is potentially a tricky aspect of German grammar, perhaps not the single hardest thing that students struggle with for German GCSE and iGCSE. If I had to pinpoint or identify just one aspect of German grammar that trips people up the most, it would probably be word order or adjective endings, but this is still a very relevant part of German grammar. Separable and inseparable verbs, both of them, are actually very common within the German language. You'll come across many of them, including in texts, in the reading exam, and in the audios for listening as well. And you do need to know them, know how to use them when speaking and writing too, and know how they differ from each other. So we're going to go through all of that here. Firstly, just as an introduction, separable and inseparable prefix verbs are types of verbs that exist in German, but definitely do not exist in English. We do have phrasal verbs and things in English, but nothing quite like the German separable and inseparable prefix verbs. They are very common in German, so even some of the most common verbs that you'll come across are actually separable and inseparable prefix verbs. And some of the first verbs that you'll learn and start using, you may well use them without even knowing that they're separable or inseparable prefix verbs. Both of these, separable and inseparable verbs, they both consist of a base verb, the fundamental verb that forms the base, and then a prefix added on at the start. A prefix, of course, is by definition an extra few letters that you add at the start of a word. So here you would add a prefix, normally just a few letters, onto the start of the base verb. And that prefix could either be a separable prefix or an inseparable prefix, as we'll see. For separable verbs, the prefix separates from the rest of the verb. That's why they're called separable verbs. Whereas for inseparable verbs, the prefix remains part of the main verb. So the prefix is effectively absorbed as part of the actual main verb. For inseparable verbs, it doesn't separate from that base verb, it becomes part of it. Yeah, and we'll see how this works in different examples and different tenses. But that is the crucial difference. Separable prefixes separate from the rest of the verb. Inseparable prefixes do not stand alone or do not separate at all, and they remain part of that main base verb. Okay, we're going to start off then by looking at separable prefix verbs or separable verbs, or trennbare Verben, as they're called in German. So separable verbs will consist of a base verb with a prefix in front. There are various different prefixes that are possible. There's quite a big list at the bottom of this slide here. And I would say that those are all of the ones that you'd really need to know for GCSE. If you know all of those and you've memorized that they are all separable prefixes too, then you're doing very well. That is plenty, or even more than enough for GCSE and iGCSE German. These separable prefix verbs behave, or they work differently in different tenses, though, too. In the present tense, perhaps the most common, or the first tense that people generally learn, the separable prefix, the prefix in front of the base verb, that separates from the rest of the verb, and it actually goes right to the end of the clause or sentence. I'll give you an example here. The infinitive of the separable prefix verb here is aufstehen, which means to get up. Auf, which is underlined, that's the separable prefix. That's the prefix which has been added on at the start of the base verb. Stehen is actually the base verb. And all of these base verbs, they must exist in any case in the German language. Aufstehen, though, if you put together the separable prefix auf and the base verb stehen, that creates aufstehen, which means to get up. So that is the infinitive form, the separable prefix in the front, of course. In the present tense, that separable prefix auf would separate from the rest of the verb, from the base verb, and it would go right to the end of the clause or the sentence. So you wouldn't say ich aufstehe or anything like that. It would actually become ich stehe 7 Uhr auf, for example, meaning I get up at 7 o'clock. So the separable prefix auf has totally separated from the main verb and gone right at the end of the clause or the sentence. Whenever you're using these verbs in the present tense, these separable verbs, you must remember that the prefix separates and goes separately right to the end of the clause. That is very important to remember because you will have to do that likely when you're speaking or writing in German. Even with other separable prefixes, the pattern in the present tense will be exactly the same. So you can see that the base verb and the separable prefix actually separated by quite a lot of material in between here. That's how it works in the present tense. In the perfect tense, though, the main past tense, perhaps in German, in that case, the prefix stays attached to the base verb. In fact, it goes right to the beginning of the past participle. So if we look at the same verb, aufstehen, the past participle of stehen is gestanden, effectively, which translates as got up in English. This is a separable prefix verb, of course, though. So we've also got the separable prefix auf in front, and that separable prefix stays in front of the past participle in the perfect tense. So instead of gestanden, it becomes aufgestanden. So in the perfect tense, you simply put the separable prefix in front at the start of the past participle. For example, ich bin 7 Uhr aufgestanden. That's the perfect tense, so past. I got up at 7 o'clock. So in the present tense, separable prefix verbs, the prefix separates, goes to the end of the clause, but in the perfect tense, it doesn't. It joins the past participle. It actually goes right to the front of the past participle. Then normally you'd have the letters ge, ge, and then the rest of the past participle, which, as in this case with the verb stehen, actually can change quite a bit in form. And then lastly, just to go through some common separable prefixes, this is a very full list for GCSE and iGCSE. Those include ab, an, auf, aus, ein, mit, nach, vor, weg, zu, and zurück. So a lot of these are prepositions, of course. Well, they're all prepositions. So you're likely to remember these as prepositions in any case. And these prefixes do not change. So every single one of these prefixes, they're always separable prefixes. So if you come across any of these prefixes, they'll always separate from the main verb or the base verb in the present tense and go right to the start of the past participle in the perfect tense. Every time you come across ab as a prefix or auf as a prefix of a verb, that's what it will do. None of these prefixes could be inseparable prefixes. So certain prefixes are simply always separable prefixes in German, and other prefixes, as we'll see, will always be inseparable prefixes. So it's just a case of memorizing which ones are the separable prefixes and which are the inseparable prefixes, and then knowing how each type of verb works. Okay, so that's all about separable prefix verbs. Again, these concepts in German grammar are not necessarily that easy, so you may well need to go back over and revisit parts of this video and practice harder aspects too. Now, though, let's go on to inseparable prefix verbs, or untrennbare Verben, as they're called in German. So inseparable prefix verbs, as the name suggests, they consist of a base verb again with a prefix in front, like separable prefix verbs, except that the prefixes here will be a bit different. So whereas we saw that certain prefixes, ab, an, auf, and so on, will always be separable ones, there are other prefixes, the ones given at the bottom here, that will always be inseparable prefixes. In other words, if the verb starts with b, be, emp, ent, g, mis, fer, or z, that means that will always be an inseparable prefix verb. If it starts with any one of those prefixes, it's got to be an inseparable prefix verb. So you can simply memorize that these prefixes are for inseparable verbs, and those ones that we saw before on this slide are for separable verbs. So a bit of learning to do, but once you've done that, that'll help massively in recognizing them. In terms of how they work, inseparable verbs are generally a fair bit easier because these prefixes do not split from the base verb at all, regardless of the tense. Even though there is still a prefix there, such as in this verb bekommen, we've effectively just put the prefix, the inseparable prefix be, in front of the verb kommen. And that creates a new verb, which in the infinitive, bekommen, means to get. Even though we've done that, so there is a prefix actually there, the prefix acts as if it's part of the main verb, essentially. So in the present tense, for example, unlike separable verbs, this verb will not separate at all. So you'd simply say, ich bekomme ein Geschenk, for example, I get a gift. If it was a separable prefix, you'd have something like, ich komme ein Geschenk be, but that doesn't happen here. That sounds very odd, actually, in German. Yeah, because be is an inseparable prefix, which just gets absorbed as part of the main verb, essentially. So it remains together as one, as in this example, ich bekomme ein Geschenk. For inseparable verbs in the perfect tense too, again, that inseparable prefix like be, emp, ent, and so on, that remains part of the past participle. The only thing to remember here, or the difference, is that there is no ge, there is no g added to the past participle for inseparable prefix verbs. There is a ge that's usually there at the beginning of past participles in German, but that's not the case for inseparable verbs. That ge is removed, and it's effectively replaced by this inseparable prefix instead. In this case, that inseparable prefix is be, but it could be g, mis, or something else instead. So if we look at this sentence in the past or perfect tense, that would become, ich habe ein Geschenk bekommen. I got a gift. So again, we've got subject pronoun ich, meaning I, the auxiliary verb habe, the direct object, ein Geschenk, the thing that you got or received, and then the past participle bekommen, which notably doesn't have a ge or ge in there, which is unusual for German past participles and only really occurs with inseparable prefix verbs. The be, that inseparable prefix, has basically taken the place of the standard ge, that normally comes at the beginning of German past participles. Okay, and the common inseparable prefixes are these ones: be, emp, ent, ge, mis, ver, and ser. So do memorize that list, get used to those ones, and yeah, the more you can remember that those prefixes are just inseparable ones, the better. Whereas on the other hand, these prefixes at the bottom here are separable ones. Okay, in terms of recognizing separable and inseparable verbs, you can normally recognize if a German verb is a separable or inseparable verb from the prefix itself. That's the easiest way, and the easiest way to know how to handle them as well. If the prefix is one of these, be, ge, ver, ser, emp, ent, or mis, then it will never separate. All other prefixes are very likely to be separable prefixes. So that's the easiest way to remember them and recognize them. I would simply learn this list of about eight prefixes, which are almost inevitably inseparable prefixes, and then simply remember that any other prefixes are almost definitely going to be separable ones. And that reduces your effort hugely and makes it much easier to see whether it's a separable or an inseparable verb that you're dealing with. Of course, you then have to know how to use it correctly, but that's not necessarily, that too challenging. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the chance to test yourself on separable and inseparable prefix verbs with some example questions. So how do you say in German, he calls his mother? That's the first one. He calls his mother. You do need to know the verb to call, anrufen, here. That's the infinitive form. And of course, you need to think through whether that prefix is separable or inseparable. So first identify the prefix, then think about whether that's a separable or inseparable verb. Once you've decided about that, you then need to conjugate it or use it correctly, decide on what tense this sentence would go into in German, and translate the rest of the information too. Okay, so let me give some thinking time for this. Okay, I will show the answer then. So, ruft seine Mutter an. This is an example of a separable prefix verb. So, anrufen, as I said, is the infinitive. That consists of the separable prefix an, and then the main or base verb, rufen. So we conjugate that main verb or base verb. Rufen becomes ruft in the third person singular. And this is the present tense, of course. He calls would be the present tense in English and in German. And that separable prefix, which was an, that goes right to the end of the clause or sentence here. And it becomes ruft seine Mutter an. Okay, so that's an example of a separable prefix verb in the present tense again. Number two, then, we understand the question. So you do need to know vocabulary too here. Verstehen is the verb to understand in the infinitive form. Again, same thing to do. So you've got to think through if that is a separable or inseparable prefix, what the prefix even is, and then think about how you would use it again in the present tense here, and translate the rest of the sentence too, of course. Okay, I'll give you 5 more seconds or so. Let's go through this too then. So this answer would be wir verstehen die Frage. This is an inseparable prefix verb. So verstehen, to understand, very common verb, of course, an important one for GCSE. That is an inseparable prefix verb. The prefix is ver, that is always an inseparable prefix. So it doesn't separate from the rest of the verb, the main or the base verb. They remain together, and you'd simply conjugate it then as wir verstehen in the present tense. The question in German would be die Frage. Here, that's in the accusative case, but doesn't change form at all. It remains die Frage. So wir verstehen die Frage. Inseparable verbs tend to be a bit easier. Overall. Okay, last example then, or last question. Today I visited my grandma. We arrived at 5 p.m. Obviously, a few things to note here. There's two verbs, of course. I visited and we arrived. So you have to think about each of those. And this is, of course, in the past tense, in the perfect tense. So we've switched tenses here. We're no longer in the present. You're going to have to put everything in the perfect tense here, one by one again. So let me give you a bit longer, as there's more to think through here. A little bit more time, 5-10 seconds. Okay, let's see the answer to this too. So this in German would become Heute habe ich meine Oma besucht. Wir sind 17 Uhr angekommen. We can start with the first verb, I visited. To visit in German is besuchen. That's the infinitive. So it is an inseparable prefix verb. The prefix be is always inseparable. So even in the perfect tense, it remains as part of the past participle. It doesn't separate in any way. And it simply replaces the ge of the past participle. The past participle therefore becomes besucht. And it takes the auxiliary verb haben. So that becomes Heute habe ich meine Oma besucht. Oma is grandma in German. Today I visited my grandma. The second verb then, to arrive, that is ankommen in German. Unlike besuchen, an is a separable prefix. So ankommen is a separable prefix verb, and therefore, in the perfect tense, the separable prefix goes to the front of the past participle, followed by ge, and then the rest of the past participle. So if we put it together, that past participle goes to angekommen. That's for a separable prefix verb. And as a separable prefix, then ge, and then the rest of the past participle. And ankommen, to arrive, that takes the auxiliary verb sein. So it becomes wir sind. Wir sind 17 Uhr angekommen. Can definitely seem tricky. I don't think this is the absolute hardest feature of German grammar. It definitely can look scary, particularly at the beginning, but with practice tends to get quite a bit easier, in my experience working with many other students. So do practice it. Make sure you understand the difference between the two types of verbs, separable and inseparable ones. There are, of course, verbs which are not separable or inseparable at all. Make sure you're clear on how to use each of them. Okay, and I will test you briefly now on your understanding of these separable and inseparable prefix verbs in German. So question 1, in the present tense, where does the prefix of a separable verb go? We're looking at separable verbs here. So where does the prefix for a separable verb go in the present tense? Okay, now let me show the answer. So in the present tense, as we mentioned, the prefix for separable verbs goes to the end of the clause or sentence. Very important to remember that. Number 2, true or false, verbs with the prefix be are inseparable verbs. Try to remember, think back to that prefix in particular, which we did see, and whether that is a prefix for separable or inseparable verbs. Okay, I'm going to show the answer then. This one is true. So be or but is an inseparable prefix. So verbs with that particular prefix will always be inseparable verbs. Question number 3, true or false again. Verbs with the prefix ab are inseparable verbs. Again, try and remember that specific prefix and perhaps which list you saw it in, the prefix ab, and try and think if that is a separable or inseparable prefix. Those two lists that we came across and saw earlier. Okay, let me show you the answer. This one's false this time, so ab is a separable prefix instead of an inseparable prefix. So any verb starting with that prefix ab, that's always going to be a separable verb. And lastly, how do you form the perfect tense for separable verbs? So again, we're asking about separable verbs here. In the perfect tense, how do they go? How do you form them in that perfect tense? A few more minutes then, a few more seconds rather, to think. Okay, here comes the answer. So for separable verbs in the perfect tense, the separable prefix will go right to the beginning of the past participle, followed by the rest of the past participle. So it's normally going to be separable prefix, then g, the letters ge, and then the final part of the past participle. All of that is written together as one word. So it's all mashed together into one word. Okay, if you've got any questions at all regarding any of this, or if you'd like to know about more personalized help and classes, which I do too, then you can get in touch with me by email, Facebook, or Instagram. I do post on social media, Facebook, Instagram, even LinkedIn, pretty much every day. I talk a lot about my passion for languages, how to learn languages, why it's fun and beneficial to do so. And I do talk a lot about exams, like GCSE exams too, and how you can prepare for those, how to revise as well as you can, and so on, mindset and more. So do follow me on each of those platforms. I have many resources, free resources too, available, including for German GCSE and iGCSE students. Including key phrases, revision tips, and more. So you can get in contact to access any of those. And I do one-to-one classes, group classes, courses, and a lot more. So do get in touch if you'd like to know about any of that.